Hey everyone. All right. I've got a couple people here. Hopefully, more people join soon. So, today I'm talking about one of my favorite topics, um, which is normative entanglement. So, normative entanglement is this idea that I came up with over the past few years from all my discussions with moral realists, moral anti realists, different people taking different views on metaethics. There is, as usual for these, an accompanying blog post that goes with this. One of the things I considered is to start doing recordings where I just read the blog posts and then upload those as separate videos, and then I could put that with the blog so you could have like an audio version of the blog as well. And I may sort of move away from making all the live streams specifically about particular blog posts so that they could be more open-ended and not sort of restricted in terms of the content. Something I'm going to start doing on occasion when at the beginning or end of videos is to ask you to like, to subscribe, hit the notification bell, do all those things. If you're enjoying this content, if you're returning or whether you're new, I really would appreciate that. That is going to help me grow this channel because this is a brand new channel. I'm just getting started. I know I'm late in the game. People have had YouTube channels for years, and I am, fairly new to doing all of this. And it took a while to get started, and I just decided to get going. If you didn't see last week, I had the first recorded video that was made specifically for this channel, and I think on the 21st, about 10 days from now, I'm going to be rebroadcasting my appearances on other channels. So I've been asking people whose channels have been on, hey, could I re-upload your video to my channel and, give a link to your channel and create those sort of bridges with other channels. And that's really to start aggregating a lot of my content in one location. Because I was doing this for a little over a year. I was appearing on other people's channels. So again, whether you're new or you've been here before, my big thing is metaethics. So I focus on this branch of philosophy which deals with abstract questions about the nature of morality. And my big focus is in the dispute between moral realism and anti-realism. So I'm not going to do this every week, but just very quickly as an overview, realism is this view that there are stance-independent moral facts. There's facts about what's morally right or wrong, good or bad, that are true independent of people's goals or standards or values or anything like that. And anti-realism is simply the position that denies that that's true. So I focus a lot on that. And I will begin branching out. I think in the upcoming weeks, I have a couple new topics that I'll be talking about. One of them is my particular area of specialization, which is the psychology of metaethics. So what I study is how non-philosophers think about traditionally philosophical topics. So, I study, you construct surveys and various sorts of psychological measures. You could do interviews. There's all sorts of ways of measuring people's metaethical views. Then you go out and you administer these surveys. This could be in online survey platforms. This could be in person. You could bring people into a lab and have them participate in an experiment. And the goal of these studies is to evaluate questions related to how non-philosophers think about, this traditionally philosophical topic, this very abstract topic, metaethics. And one of the central questions in that research is, are people moral realists or are they some type of anti-realist? And if so, what kind? But there are other questions you could ask. You could ask questions like, how does one's metaethical views influence their behavior? So if you're a moral realist, does this make you more rigid in your moral standards than an anti-realist? If you're an anti-realist, are you more likely to commit immoral action? So there's questions like that. So I study those questions, and I do something that's maybe a little bit amusing, at least I'm amused by it, which is that I study how to do that. So I study the methodology of these studies. So in a certain sense, you could say that I do meta-ethics. So I'm going to be talking about that next week. And then the week after that, I'm going to be talking about phenomenal conservatism. So we've got some new stuff coming up. I know I've been going on and on about moral realism for a month now, something like that, since I got the channel started. And we're going to be branching out into a few different topics. I'll always be coming back to the realism stuff. That's really my big thing. But we'll be talking about other topics. Some of my appearances on other channels have focused more on these psychological questions. And really my interests span the sort of breadth of meta questions. So I'm interested in how science works and how to improve it. I'm interested in how to do philosophy and how to improve it. So I'm interested in these metaphilosophical and meta-scientific questions. And we'll be exploring those topics as the channel grows. So, hopefully I'll be getting discussions going on the channel. There's all sorts of content I'd like to have. So I'd like to have interviews where I interview other people. I can bring people on. They can question me. I don't care. I might host debates or discussions between people. I don't like those hostile debates where people are like, you're an idiot. No, you shut up. I don't like those. So I'm not going to be doing that. But getting people at different points of view to discuss their views. I'd really like to talk about consciousness sometime. So one of these views that's growing in popularity is panpsychism. And there's, panpsychists and illusionists, different people that talk about the nature of consciousness. I'd like to talk about that on this channel. So there's a bunch of stuff that I'll be doing on the channel as we go forward. But a big focus for me has been on features of philosophical disputes that have largely gone unaddressed. And I think that this is because of the nature of contemporary disputes in philosophy. A big part of the focus is on just the sort of scholarly nature of the disputes. And I think that if you look carefully at how philosophers pitch and discuss and frame the various sorts of positions that they advocate for and that they object to, what you'll often find is that lurking beneath the sort of thin veneer of a purely scholarly dispute is a sort of dark underworld of rhetoric and implication and efforts to subtly undermine opposing points of view and elevate one's own point of view, not by demonstrating the genuine merits, like the intellectual merits of one's position and the demerits of rival positions, but by implying, or in some cases even explicitly stating, even if falsely, that your view is better and their view is worse. Like, it's just a brute normative appeal to pick my side, don't pick that other side. And one of the things I want to talk about today is normative entanglement, because I think that this is a central element of the ongoing dispute between moral realists and moral anti-realists. And I think that it's exceptionally common for normative entanglement to occur both within the academic context. I do think it occurs there, but especially outside academic context. So I think the easiest way to talk about this is to go through my blog post, and then I'll pick it up from there. But before I do that, let me say hi to everyone in the chat. So we have, I guess it's Intuition. I like that. So hi, is it Captain Kim? Is that what I should call you? Intuition Demon. So hello. Ed. Hey, how's it going? We have Captive Desk. We have, is it Schnicken? We are so fucking back. Thank you. I have Jamie Russell from Christian Middle Earth. Almost sounding like you think they ought not do this thing. I do think they ought not do it. So, I can't say it a lot live. So hi, Jonathan. You have a question for later. Okay. And Priscilla, hi. So we've got a few people here. Welcome, everyone. And I'll address this remark if you remind me, especially if I forget, because I think it's one well worth addressing. But let me get through the blog post first. Okay, so the blog post is pinned, and I know some people, the other thing I'll mention is I think a couple people said that they would be interested in joining the live stream. So if they're around or they show up, please definitely say so in the chat. Definitely tag me if you do, so I know that you're here, especially if it's relevant to the topic today. And I'll talk to you after I get through the blog post and we talk a bit about it. And then I could pin the link to StreamYard so you could join in. Okay, so and again, you could check out the blog post itself, which is again pinned in the chat. Okay, so normative entanglement is a common rhetorical strategy moral realists employ when arguing for moral realism. It's akin in some ways to a loaded question. You're presented with a dichotomy that presents the superficial impression of a legitimate yes-no question. However, it's a setup. If you say yes, this is taken as a concession to the realist. If you say no, it's used as a bludgeon to imply you're an awful person with a permissive attitude towards moral atrocities. Here's how it works. The realist can ask a question like this, quote, do you think it's immoral to torture people for fun? They can insist that this is a clear question and that you should give a yes or no answer. If you say yes, they interpret this as a concession that you share the realist's metaethical intuitions, not merely their normative ones. So realism wins. If you say no, they imply or explicitly suggest that you are okay with, or in some cases support, torturing people for fun. That is, you're an awful person with disgusting and horrible views. This is taken as a reductio of anti-realism. The anti-realist, after all, must concede that they're okay with torturing people. So realism wins. This is a trick. Don't fall for it. There are a few problems with this trick. The first is that it relies on ambiguity. When they ask whether it's immoral to torture people for fun, note that it superficially appears to be merely asking a question about your concrete, first-order moral beliefs. That is, what you think is right or wrong morally. That is, shouldn't have said that is twice, but I did. That is, it does not look like a question about your metaethical standards. Metaethical standards would concern what you think it means for it to be morally wrong to torture people for fun. Even an anti-realist can say and think that it's morally wrong to torture people for fun. They just mean something different than the realist. As such, it is completely consistent with moral anti-realism to respond, yes, I think it is morally wrong to torture people for fun. However, if you say yes to this question, the realist will often treat this as a concession to realism. It is not. One's normative moral stance has no necessary relation to their metaethical stance. Note that if the moral realist merely intends to ask a normative question in the first place, this would make no sense. The question wouldn't be probative of your metaethical stance. So, if it is merely a normative question, it's an irrelevant question. So then, why are they asking it? They're asking it because they can strategically equivocate on and fix the meaning of immoral after you respond. If you respond by saying yes, they can interpret this as an implicit concession that you have the intuition not simply that it's wrong normatively, but that it's wrong in the way that realists think things are wrong, which they can then use to slap you with the charge that you're sharing the realist's intuition. This then gives them the edge in relying on the presumptive argument. Realism seems true, it's the default position, so the onus is on anti-realists to argue against it, not for realists to argue for it. So just as a quick commentary, just to elaborate on that a bit. What I'm saying here is that if you say yes, they can interpret it after the fact as though you're at the very least conceding that you have the realist intuition. So if you say, oh yeah, well, it seems wrong in some objective sense, you could then say, but I don't think that it is wrong, in spite of the fact that it seems that way. So this is often how disputes between moral realists and anti-realists begin, with a presumption that certain actions seem wrong in the sense that realists think that they seem wrong. And realists will often push the view that all or most people, or at least all or most people that are thinking clearly about metaethics, will share this intuition. And this is the main thing that I've been challenging, and it's one of the main things that has motivated my interest in the research on the psychology of metaethics. Namely that there just isn't a lot of evidence that all or most people find moral realism to be intuitive. There just isn't a lot of empirical support for this. Okay, so where was I? Right. Okay, so realists rely on shifting the burden of proof onto anti-realists to take the pressure off of them, so they don't have to present arguments for moral realism. It's a move designed to put the anti-realist on the dialectical back foot and present realism as the dominant position. If you say no, on the other hand, this is a mistake. What are you saying no to? The metaethical presupposition is implicit in the question, but the question looks like a normative question. So if you say no, it looks like you're saying that you don't oppose or disapprove or have negative attitudes towards or think it's immoral or whatever to torture people for fun. For comparison, imagine a person who says, I don't think it's immoral to steal. If you're an anti-realist, you could mean, I don't think there's a stance-independent normative fact such that it's a violation of that fact to steal. However, that's not what the statement looks like. It looks instead like you have a lax attitude towards stealing, that you think it's morally permissible as a matter of first-order moral principle, not simply that you don't think there's a stance-independent normative fact about the moral status of stealing. What moral realists are doing is a trap. And it's a trap because it presents the anti-realist with an ambiguous question that superficially appears to be clear, straightforward, and a clear, straightforward, and reasonable question to ask, but it is no such thing. Instead, it's a subtle rhetorical move that lets the realist either imply you've made a concession to realism when you haven't, or that it fails to insinuate that you are Oh, I'm gonna have to fix that. Or that it insinuates that you're an evil baby torturer if you say no. So a second problem, which I didn't mention earlier, is that it implicitly presupposes the intelligibility of the realist presupposition. That is, if the question is taken to actually reflect a question about moral realism, such that it's something like this: do you think it's a, quote, a stance-independent moral fact that it's immoral to torture people for fun? This question can only be answered with a yes or no if the question is intelligible. I don't think that it is. Rather, I think the notion of a stance-independent normative fact, if it isn't trivialized by naturalists, is unintelligible. So I have no way to answer the question. Yet again, the trick is that the question won't typically make the metaethical presupposition explicit. This makes the question look like a reasonable one because it isn't using technical jargon. Imagine a realist had to ask the question more clearly. Do you think it's a stance-independent normative fact that it's wrong to torture people for fun? Saying no here has a lot less rhetorical blowback. Here's the thing. If this is what moral realists actually intend to ask, why don't they ask it this way? Why drop all the metaethical terms and ask using plain language that buries their presuppositions? Yet there's a problem. Even if the question was made more explicit, saying no can still have a certain taint to it. In other words, if you said no, even to the question, do you think it's a stance-independent moral fact that it's immoral to torture people for fun? That can, if you say no, it could still look bad. Unfortunately, the pragmatics of the elements in the question are inescapable. Any response which involves saying no to a question about torturing people could be perceived to carry some implication that you have a permissive or supportive attitude towards torture. Even if you say no, but, and go on to clarify that you're really super duper against torturing people for fun, it can still make you seem a little sketchy to people. As such, I want to call for a moratorium on presenting this kind of question in crude form. Whether intentional or not, even if it is framed carefully and the anti-realist is permitted to respond not just with a yes or a no, but to elaborate, there's still an inescapable pragmatic residue, a kind of stench that accompanies asking the question. And anti-realists have no way to completely remove the stench. Even if you hand us a bucket of bleach and a swimming pool full of philosophical Febreze, the mere suggestion that we may be totally okay with torturing people for fun will haunt us, forever casting a pall of suspicion over moral anti-realists as a coterie of people who maybe, just maybe, have a secret underground chamber full of bones and screams. Thus, there are two problems with normative entanglement and the standard entanglement question I presented. First, it's ambiguous, and this ambiguity follows for all kinds of sophistic mischief, if you will. Second, the realist is implicitly appealing to concepts the anti-realist is in a position to reject. So it relies on dubious concepts that may not be intelligible. If so, then there's no way to provide a straightforward yes or no answer, even if the question weren't ambiguous. For comparison, imagine a parallel argument that employed both tricks from the anti-realist perspective, but where the tricks are made extremely clear. Imagine the anti-realist asks a moral question like this: do you think it's florp to torture people for fun? Suppose you're presented with this question in a public discussion, and your interlocutor insisted that you provide either a yes or a no. No prevarications, no stalling, answer the question. What would you say? Yes or no? So again, the question is, do you think it's florp to torture people for fun? If you're like me, you'll see this question for what it is. Someone insisting you play a custom Minesweeper map they designed where every square is a mine. It doesn't matter how lightly you step. If you play, you lose. In fact, the anti-realists can be so assured of victory, they could just tell you how they'll respond to a yes or no. And they could do this in advance. They could say, if you say yes, you concede anti-realism is the intuitive common sense position. Now the burden of proof shifts on you, realist. Ha! If you say no, then you're in favor of torturing people for fun. That's a reductio of realism. Anti-realism wins. Again, ha! Now now that that's out of the way, your choice is to simply pick which way you want to lose. In short, moral realists often employ a rhetorical trick. For some reason, I've never seen anyone clearly lay out and describe this trick in detail. So I hope my impromptu efforts to detail the maneuver, I initially did this in a Facebook post, will go some way in spreading awareness of the trap. However, I have a few more tasks to complete. Number one, the first and most important task is to provide evidence that this is a move moral realists actually employ. Concrete examples in forums, live discussions, and even published articles will be imperative. There's no point in devising a solution to something that isn't an actual problem. If you have examples of this or can point me to where I might find them, let me know. Two, empirical evidence for the claim regarding pragmatics. That is, I predict non-philosophers will judge someone who responds to the kinds of questions I discuss here by judging the anti-realist response of a no to imply that they're a bad person. And then finally, number 3, effective strategies for responding to this kind of rhetorical move. Hopefully this will become unnecessary as moral realists recognize the move for what it is and stop employing it. Okay, so that's the end of what I had to say there. I knew I was going to find at least one little mistake that I have to fix in there, so I'll fix that later. But yeah, so that's the blog post, and that's normative entanglement. So to wrap it up, basically you get the situation where, and I don't lay it out clearly here, I'm going to have to elaborate and develop on this, and I have some other places where I've talked about this. This is what's going on. When the question is asked, a normative question is embedded inside a metaethical question, and you're expected to answer both simultaneously. So this can happen even if the metaethical presuppositions are explicit. So this could look like this. Someone could even ask you with the metaethical language, do you think it's objectively wrong to torture babies for fun? Now, no, of course, if you're an anti-realist, you can't say yes, because then you're conceding that that you are a moral realist. Like, you're not an anti-realist anymore if you say yes to that question. Because, recall, the question is, do you think it's objectively wrong to torture babies for fun? So if you say yes, you're agreeing with two things there. One, that it's wrong to torture babies for fun. That's a normative claim. And two, that the wrongness of that action is objective. So that's the metaethical claim. Note you're responding to both questions. Those are conceptually distinguishable from one another. But what if you say no? So actually, if you say no to that question, is it objectively wrong to torture babies for fun? You could be a realist, right? You could actually think that there are objective moral facts. You could just think that it's okay to torture babies for fun, or at least that it's not wrong. You could think that. So that's one way you could respond. You could just reject the normative claim. The other way you could respond is, well, no, because you don't think it's objectively wrong. But know that there's an asymmetry in the question. If you answer yes, automatically you're a realist about the issue. So that tells us your metaethical stance, and you are expressing a specific normative stance. But if you say no, it's now unclear what your actual stance is, because you're responding to a normative and a metaethical question at the same time. So if you say no, again, it could be because you're an evil realist that thinks it's not wrong to torture babies for fun, like normatively, or because you're an anti-realist. So now, automatically, if someone says no, even from just like a Bayesian point of view, we can update that the actual likelihood that the person thinks it's normative, like on normative grounds, thinks it's okay to torture babies, has increased because they said no. Because now we've ruled out that they're both a realist who holds the normative view that it's wrong, but we haven't ruled out that they're a realist who doesn't hold the normative view that it's wrong. So they could still be an evil, like pro-baby torture person. So the anti-realist automatically gets lumped in with another position that's conceptually distinct from their own with that no. This is the problem. They're embedding two questions inside of one another and expecting you to give one definitive yes or no response. The other problem has to do with pragmatics. And if you're not familiar with pragmatics, roughly the idea is that when we use language, you could focus on the sort of strict meaning of the words in a sentence or the sentence as a whole, but much of the meaning of what we say in everyday situations is conveyed via tone or the context in which we're in, or some other features of the context that carry additional elements of the meaning of what's being communicated that aren't strictly reducible to a sort of formal analysis of the meaning of the individual words. And this, we're all familiar with this. With, if someone goes, yeah, right, there's sarcasm there. Sarcasm isn't a feature of the sentence. The exact same sentence can mean that you agree or that you disagree, depending on your tone. So the tone isn't a part of the words. So the problem here is that sometimes things are implied indirectly due to the way that we phrase things. So this is what's going on here. The implication is that if you say no to this question, maybe you're a bad person. Maybe you're kind of okay with baby torture, or at least maybe you're not that as against it as the moral realist. And this is another thing that I think moral realists often take advantage of, is if, take two people. One person says, I think it's objectively wrong to torture babies for fun. Another person goes, I'm a moral relativist. I think it's subjectively wrong to torture babies for fun. I think a lot of people would think that the second person isn't as sincerely committed to their values, doesn't think it's quite as wrong, and so on. They would think that that person's less against baby torture. And yet none of that is logically entailed by being a subjectivist, because Again, there's the normative position, your opposition to baby torture, is entangled with your metaethical position, and there's bleed over, there's conceptual spillover from expressing your metaethical stance that leaves people with the impression that there's variation in your normative stance as a consequence, even when there isn't. So yeah, that's what the post is about. I saw lots of stuff in the chat go by, so I'm gonna pause there to see. And if you have questions about what I read or about normative entanglement, let me know. All right, I see a lot of stuff here. Okay, let's see. This might be some of them might not be related. Let's see. Does XY have to worry about normative entanglement when framing questions? I can imagine a Bradley effect type thing here where people's metaethical responses are biased because of normative concerns. Absolutely, yes, it is a problem. So, a lot of my empirical research focuses on experimental philosophy questions about people's metaethical views. And yeah, I think normative considerations are a major factor here. So this can emerge in a variety of ways. But generally speaking, I think that people are cautious when responding to questions like that one. Or, you're not going to see too many of questions like the one I posed in what I wrote, but you might see questions like this. Alex and Sam disagree about whether murder is wrong. Alex thinks murder is wrong. Sam thinks murder is not wrong. Do you think that Alex and Sam can both be correct? Or do you think at least one of them has to be incorrect? And a person might pause and think, well, if I say they're both correct, I'm implying that I think murder might be okay, or at least okay for some people to do. When you actually ask people why let's say a person says no, at least one of them has to be incorrect. If you ask people what they mean, like why they answered that way or what they take that to mean, they'll often report normative attitudes. Well, I chose that because of course murder's wrong. So that suggests that people may be interpreting these questions as questions about their normative views. But it could be that there's some unconscious drive for people to respond in socially desirable ways. So social desirability bias is a bias that can occur when you're conducting empirical research, where you're asking people to self-report or do things or whatever, where the person has to do something that could signal characteristics about that person. And people might change their behavior when they know they're being observed or when they could be observed in order to act in ways that are more socially desirable. They don't want to damage their reputation. And that could certainly influence the way that people respond to questions about metaethics. Interestingly, it won't necessarily and always favor giving a realist response, because people will also associate the realist response with rigidity, inflexibility, religiosity, a variety of characteristics that they either don't have, like that, they might not be religious and they might not want to signal they're religious if they're not. Or it might be things that pretty much everybody would consider bad. So, no one typically, in most circumstances, is going to want to be rigid. Someone might say, yeah, I'm rigid on being against baby torture. So in the case of baby torture, people might be more okay with saying, yeah, I'm a realist about that. It's wrong. But when it comes to more controversial moral issues, if you remain seemingly steadfast or rigid or uncompromising about it, that could start to signal bad character traits. People want you to be rigid about certain things and more flexible about others. And so I think that people to the extent that people's responses may be biased towards or reflect social desirability bias, it's going to vary based on what's being asked specifically. And it won't always be that it's favorable to express a realist stance. Sometimes it'll be favorable to express an anti-realist stance. When I talk about that empirical research in the coming weeks, then I'll get into more detail about the precise questions that are asked and what the evidence for that looks like. But this is almost certainly going on and is influencing how people respond to these questions. I should also say that the measures of relativism and tolerance are pretty highly correlated. They're not super duper high, but they're high enough that there's a strong association there. Why exactly that is, social desirability concerns may play a role either directly when people are responding to both sets of questions, or indirectly in that social desirability might cause people to come to adopt both of those views, both the tolerant attitude and relativism. It could also be a conceptual or philosophical performance error where people are mistakenly thinking that relativism implies tolerance or tolerance implies relativism. It doesn't. It's not like a logical entailment one way in either direction. Or it could be that there's some third variable that causes people to endorse both. There's a whole bunch of potential causal pathways that could be at work here. So this is a good question. What do you think is the best way to respond when a realist uses this rhetorical tactic? Now, one thing I should say, and I mentioned it in passing there. What I'm not saying is that realists are deliberately employing like rhetorical strategies. I don't know that realists are aware of this issue. And as far as I know, I haven't seen anyone publish papers on this or discuss this pretty much anywhere. So it's not entirely clear to me that people are even aware of this. I think generally speaking, people are insensitive to pragmatics in this way. And the result of this may be that they're just not aware that they're doing this. As far as how you might respond, there's a few things you could do. So one of these things is something that draws on an understanding of pragmatics, which is cancellation. So you could respond. Let's say someone asks you, do you think it's objectively wrong to torture babies for fun? And I think a couple of people mentioned this in the community section, and I'll just stop and mention this. Every week, I'm going to be posting a poll, like a survey question or some kind of question or prompt a few hours before I go live, just to kind of get discussion going. It will usually be related to whatever topic I'm going to be focusing on, but it won't necessarily be related. It might just be something I do for fun. So get in on the discussion there. There's some good discussion there. There's some survey. The polls are still up, I think. You should be able to go and answer them. So I'll be asking questions about metaethics and other sorts of stuff. So go check that out and answer those questions and respond there. That would be awesome. Okay, anyway, so as far as how you can respond, some people mentioned some possible ways of responding. So one of the things that it would be really important to do is to either indirectly or directly respond to the normative element separately from the metaethical element. So let's say you're going through this conversation and someone says, do you think it's objectively wrong to torture babies for fun? If you're an anti-realist, here's one way you might reply. You could say, look, I think it's absolutely disgustingly, horribly wrong to torture babies for fun. The problem is you're asking me a question about whether I think it's objectively wrong to do some terrible thing. And I think the thing in question is terrible and wrong, but what I don't do is append it to these particular metaphysical or conceptual commitments you're attaching to it and treating it as though I don't think it's wrong unless I include those. One way of sort of parodying this kind of question is to say, you could say this to a realist. Do you think it's magically wrong to torture babies for fun? No. If they say yes, you can say, oh, so you believe in magic? That's absurd. If they say no, you say, oh, so you're okay with torturing babies? And I think that immediately brings to light how absurd the question is. Do you think it's magically wrong to torture babies for fun? Again, the answer shouldn't be yes, because there's no magic. But does that mean that if you say no, that means you're okay with baby torture? Of course not. So I think the way that to respond is to basically point to to normative entanglement itself and say, look, the question itself is involving normative entanglement. And this is one reason why it's going to be important for me to publish papers on this, where I describe this in detail, what the problem is. And hopefully it can make it onto a list of informal fallacies, and it could sit there alongside complex questions and loaded questions and that sort of thing. So that if someone asks the question, you could say, oh, you're going to do that normative entanglement thing, that rhetorical strategy that Lance Bush wrote about, in Bush 2023 or whatever, it's this rhetorical thing. Don't do that. It's a fallacy. So you could, hopefully we'll be in a situation in the future where we could just do that, where we could just say, yeah, this is a documented trick question you're asking me. Stop doing it. I think that's one way to respond once that work is published and that becomes available to people. So we'll be able to do that. In the meantime, or alongside that, you could just say, my normative position is that it's wrong. I don't buy into the metaphysical and conceptual baggage that you're sort of trying to graft onto that. So you've got to pull those apart. How exactly to do that, I think, is itself going to be very context dependent. But the problem is that if you do that, someone could go, look, it's a yes or no question. Give a yes or no answer. And if the person's going to do that, you could say, you're like, the problem is that if they could do this. They could always say, look, I'm asking a clear yes and no question. And if you're not going to unhesitatingly respond, because here's the problem. You can't say yes. So if you say no, if you even hesitate, they'll go, why are you hesitating? Why are you hesitating? Got something to hide? The problem is that the question is such a good trap because it's a yes or a no. And if you try to pick a third alternative, that can automatically make you look bad. It can make you look evasive or like you're trying to dodge the question. And so I think that the only route to go is to call the question out as bullshit, as a trick question, because they could say, why are you dodging? Why are you dodging? It's a yes or no question. And if the person persists in doing that, if it becomes like a meta discussion, then I think you might have to respond with similar types of rhetorical strategies to illustrate the point. Like the magical question. Do you think it's magically wrong? Do you think the moon is magically real? Do you think the moon is magically real? Yes or no? Yes or no? No, it's a clear yes or no question. And then if they say no, you go, okay, so you don't believe in the moon. You're an idiot. An idiot doesn't believe in the moon. You could do that. And if they're like, no, but I do believe in the moon. No, I asked you, does the moon magically exist? Is the moon magically real? You said no. So you're saying the moon doesn't exist. And if they're like, no, but I think it exists. I just don't think it's magical. Okay. So then I get to say, I think baby torture is wrong, just not objectively wrong. I don't have to add. And by objectively, what you mean is a bunch of metaphysical nonsense that I don't think makes things, again, more wrong or actually wrong or anything like that. Because first of all, it doesn't make it more wrong. If this is a qualitative distinction, whether something's objective or stance independent or not objective or stance independent. That's not quantitative. It's not like they think that if you're a realist, you think baby torture is 10 units of bad, but if you're an anti-realist, at most you can only think it's 9. You can't hit 10. That's nonsense. It's not a quantitative concept. It's a qualitative concept. And yet they'll imply they think it's more wrong. So they can't go that route. It's not more wrong. This isn't quantifiable. Okay, so they might say that they think it's actually wrong. What do they mean by actually? They've only got a few options here. If by actually, because realists will say this is another rhetorical strategy. Well, as a realist, I think baby torture is really wrong. You don't think it's really wrong. You think it's wrong, but only in some subjective, so notice that they're swapping out stance independent for really or actually, and stance dependent or whatever it is the anti-realist endorses for fake. What is the implication here? That you think it's fake wrong? Again, you can draw on comparisons if the discussion continues. You could ask the person, look, what's your favorite pizza topping? And let's say they say mushrooms. I like mushrooms on pizza. Do you think it tastes good? Yeah, I think mushrooms taste good. Okay. Are you an objectivist about gastronomy? Do you think if someone disagrees that mushrooms on pizza are tasty, they're mistaken? And no, I'm subjectivist about food. Okay, so you don't actually think that mushrooms on pizza are good. They might say, no, I actually think it's good. Oh, no, but you're a subjectivist. So you can't actually or really think mushrooms on pizza are good. It's not good unless it's objectively good. And again, I think that this illustrates how absurd that is. Something doesn't have to be objectively good to be actually good. Because again, what do they mean by actually or really or genuinely or truly or whatever modifier that they're using to append to the realist conception? They have a few options. One, they can just mean stance independent, in which case this is just a tautology. They're just saying, oh, so you as an anti-realist, again, anti-realism it means a person that doesn't think that the normative domain in question, let's say morality, that there are stance independent moral facts. They just don't think they're stance independent. So if they say, oh, so you don't think anything is really wrong, they're just repeating the description of your position. You don't think things are stance independently wrong. Yeah, that's what I said. I don't think things are stance independently wrong. So you don't think it's really wrong. Again, just translate really. Oh, so you don't think it's stance independently wrong. Yeah, that's what I just said. So they could say that all day long. It doesn't get them anywhere if all they mean by really or actually or genuinely or truly or whatever is stance independent. It's just they're again using rhetoric. They're using a word that has colloquial usages that have positive connotations to imply that the realist position is actual or good or desirable, and the anti-realist position isn't. If all they mean when you unpack it, though, is just a restatement of the position, they're not saying anything. It's empty. If they mean something else, what is it that they mean? They could mean that only their conception is the correct one, but imagine a dispute where you say, well, the problem with, let's say you're a theist and you're arguing with an atheist. And you say, look, the problem with atheism is that atheism holds that there's no God, but that's false. So atheism is false? What? Atheism is false because it's false? So if by only the realist thinks things are truly good, what they mean is only the realist has the correct conception of good, that can't be part of the position that it's correct. You can't say, oh, by definition, realism is the correct position. They can't do that. So what are they saying? Well, I think my position is correct and yours isn't correct. Again, that's trivial. Of course they think their position is correct and yours isn't correct. So if by truly or really or actually they mean the correct position, then what is the criticism of the anti-realist? Hey, anti-realist, you hold a view about metaethics that I think is incorrect. How dare you? What's the objection? The objection is that the position is false. Again, it's empty to say it's false because it's false, or it's objectionable because it's false. If you're going to say that's, you're asserting that as a feature of the dialectic, that's just straightforward question begging. You're just assuming your position is correct. Or they could be making a normative claim. They could say my position is good and your position is bad. Well, good or bad in what sense? Do they mean in an objective sense? Because they're not allowed to help themselves to that, again, without begging the question. So when people say the anti-realist doesn't think things are really wrong, only the realist thinks things are really wrong, that statement is either empty and vacuous and just meaningless and tautological, or it's just question begging. It's not going to get them anywhere. So this is a common thing that these discussions end up terminating in people just sort of pounding their fists and trying to make normative claims or to make anti-realism look bad. And no, this occurs with professional philosophers. This occurs in real scholarly contexts. So it's even professionals that employ this kind of rhetoric. But it looks on the surface in many cases, especially if people are being calm about it, like they're just saying something very sophisticated and scholarly and academic, and they're not. They're using rhetorical tricks. And these rhetorical tricks are unfortunately deeply embedded in the way that much of philosophy conducts itself. And it's gone under the radar, and not a lot of people are talking about it. And I am going to draw attention to it. I'm going to expose it. And I'm going to show how philosophers are constantly using this kind of stuff. They're using what amounts to basically sophistry and presenting it as though it's legitimate philosophy, and it's not. And they need to stop. We need to, criticize this when it occurs. And it's not like I don't think realists can or do present arguments for their position. And it's not. I'm not saying anti-realists don't employ dirty tricks and strategies. Lots of people do this. So I'm not saying this is like realists do bad stuff and anti-realists are not. They're the good guys. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we've kind of fallen into a lot of bad habits in contemporary philosophy, both, again, in academic and non-academic discussions, and I'm sure I do it too, where we end up taking advantage of language and implication to try to make our opponents' positions look bad. I think that this is a natural habit that everybody falls into. I think it occurs very frequently outside of formal philosophical disputes, but I think it kind of worms its way into philosophical disputes. And I don't think that this is a realist and anti-realist thing. I think realists do this. I think anti-realists do this. And I think that people do this in philosophy outside of metaethical disputes. I think it's kind of everywhere. And I want to draw attention to it so that we can notice it and we can start to work around it. We need to be able to devise the tools to see it when it occurs and to develop the sort of epistemic virtue and the habits of thought to avoid doing it. And again, I'm sure I do this. I'm sure we all engage in this kind of rhetoric. What I'm drawing attention to is that a lot of rhetoric has been fairly subtle and people aren't noticing it. And once we notice it, we need to start dealing with it. Okay. Thoughts on standardizing questionnaire forms for XFI and how to avoid methodological issues so far without giving a full philosophy lecture as part of the questionnaire. Methodological issues just because I'm not sure. Okay, so far. Isn't that how I read it? Yeah, you did write so far. All right, so standardizing the questions. So standardizing the questions, I take it you would mean that there's some sorts of principles, rules, guidelines that we would use for devising questions. Now, I'm not an expert on measurement and issues in psychology related to designing questionnaires, but there is a whole literature that anybody designing questionnaires in experimental philosophy should be drawing on because they're general principles and rules. So for instance, if you're designing a survey question, and just to give everybody here a sense of what a survey question looks like on a scale, what that might look like is often it's just going to be a sentence, and you might be presented with, say, 10 sentences, and you'll be asked something like this. Below, you will see 10 statements. Please express how much you agree or disagree with the statements using the following scale. 1, strongly disagree. 4, neither agree nor disagree. 7, strongly agree. I hope I said 1, strongly disagree. But anyway, you see that sort of 7-point scale. It could be a 10-point scale, a 5-point scale, ranging from strongly disagree to agree. There are other ways of asking these sorts of questions, like how much does this statement reflect your views? And then it could be 1, not at all, 7, a whole lot, something like that. As long as there's some sort of continuum where a person is able to express gradations of endorsement or opposition to statements. There are other ways of framing these questions, but this would be a standard way. And then you could have a statement like, If two people disagree about a moral issue, they can both be correct. And then one strongly disagrees, seven strongly agree. And then you could interpret choosing a seven as a strong indication of anti-realism, and then one as a strong indication of realism, something like that. And there's already guidelines out there. So something you absolutely want to do is avoid double-barreled questions. You don't want to ask, and that's a question that, like a sentence that's asking two questions at once. So, you could ask really silly ones. So you could say, the Earth is round and the moon landing was a hoax. Agree or disagree? What? So if you agree, you think the moon landing was a hoax. If you disagree, you think the Earth is flat. Like, there's no way to answer that question that's not going to make you look silly. So you don't want to have two questions inside of one another. Now, that is a very explicit one. And you could ask questions where it's like this and this, where the structure of the sentence makes it very clear that it's double-barreled. But double-barreled questions can often be a bit more subtle than this. So you really need to be careful of not asking sort of double questions, or especially you don't want a triple barrel question. That'd be way worse. Or quadruple barrel. You could add a whole bunch of stuff. You don't want to ask questions like that. Another thing to be mindful of is who is going to be responding to your survey. You don't want to ask questions that are use too much technical jargon or too sophisticated for people, too cognitively demanding for your audience, where they're just not going to understand what you're asking them. So for instance, you wouldn't want to give people mathematical notation or ask them weird questions about quantum mechanics if this is going to be like undergraduates that are taking like an intro to psych course. They're just not going to know what you're asking them. If it's a survey for theoretical physicists or professional philosophers, then you would reframe your questions. So you need to be sure that your questions are framed in a way that's appropriate for your audience. You need to avoid ambiguity in your questions. So a common example I give people is if you ask people, do you like to go to the bank? Well, bank has more than one use. It could refer to a place where people store money and get their money out. It could also refer to a riverbank. And if you went around asking a question like that, that could cause a lot of confusion depending on where you're asking it. For most people that live in an industrialized area, they might think, well, obviously you're asking about the money place. But if you were asking this to a bunch of people that lived in a fishing village or next to a river delta or something like that, they might think you're asking about the riverbank, because they might reason, well, you're asking me and I live by a river, so you're asking about the bank, like the riverbank. So, there's concerns like that. If you're drawing on an old survey, you're going to want to check to see if there's been any work at all to validate it and to assess its validity. And there's a bunch of other stuff you'd want to do. As far as, because this question is specifically about experimental philosophy questions, there are some things you might want to do there. Some of them are a little too sophisticated for me to get into on short notice. That's something I'd rather prepare for and really have like a list. Like, here's the things to do when designing a survey. That's just a whole different discussion. But what I would recommend, and this isn't frequently done and should frequently be done, is to pre-test the items that you're going to use. And one way to pre-test them is to give them, this could be small groups of people, or you could even run a survey online where you ask people, are there ambiguities in this question? How easy is it for you to understand this question? If you were to answer this question, what kind of thought processes would you be going through? What would you be thinking about? Or you could ask people to answer the question and then say, why did you answer this way? There's a variety of questions you could ask. They could be multiple choice. They could be also Likert scale questions. They could be open response questions where there's a text box and the person can write in a response. Or you could even bring people in. You could bring in, almost do like a focus group and bring people in. There's also various techniques you could do, like cognitive interviewing and stuff like that. You could have a person go through the questionnaire and ask them to really think out loud as they're going through it. They might go, okay, so I'm looking at question 2, but I'm not so sure about this question. It looks like it's implying that question 1 means something different. And maybe I misunderstood question 1. And so you could even understand that there could be relationships between how they're considering multiple questions simultaneously. There's a whole bunch of stuff that can happen. But the bottom line is, what you don't want to do is imagine that you can figure out how to answer how people are going to respond to these questions from the armchair, because you are not your participants. And if you're constructing a survey in philosophy, like someone in my position, I've studied a bunch of philosophy, I've studied a bunch of psychology, and I have a whole bunch of characteristics about who I am as a person and how I think that are not reflective of or representative of how other people think. And I shouldn't assume that the way other people would interpret questions is the same way I would interpret those questions. And so if you just think, how would people potentially interpret this question? If you were using your own mind to extrapolate, you could make serious mistakes. And this is one of the things I've criticized philosophers for doing. When they say stuff like most people have this intuition or whatever, they don't gather systematic empirical evidence on that. they assume other people think the way that they do. And so this is why there's another post on my blog where I talk about this, but I say this all the time. Very frequently, philosophers make empirical claims about how people think, and what they're doing is effectively doing psychology with a sample size of 1. They're just thinking, how do I think? That's how other people think. And if you think about any other context outside of philosophy, this is obviously absurd. Like, just think about what your favorite movie is. Do you think, well, this is my favorite movie, so surely it must be everyone else's favorite movie? And if they don't agree with you that it's the best movie, they just haven't learned to appreciate. No, other people just don't like the same stuff as you. Come on. And philosophers, I think that they think that their philosophical conclusions, they're sort of latching on to these fundamental truths. It's not just mere preference or mere expression of one's desires or something like that. It's something higher. It's something transcendent. And so surely if people would think right, they would think the way I think. And well, however they think about the issues, maybe they are latching on to some objective truths, but all of that is included and mired in their idiosyncrasies and their biases and their enculturation and all these other factors. And philosophers should be mindful of that fact, that there is an enormous amount of conceptual sludge between them and whatever the supposed truth is. And if you think you could just, if you have the conceptual vision, philosophical laser eyes to just go and see straight to the truth, you're wrong. And, sometimes if I say, realism is unintelligible, people say that's very arrogant. You're saying all these philosophers don't understand how to think and they're just totally confused about their positions. Yeah, I'm talking about a discipline of people that think they could just figure out how the world is by thinking about their mind has little beams that go into the universe and they could just detect the fundamental nature of reality. And I think that's complete bullshit. I don't think you could do that. And I'm the arrogant one for thinking you can't do that. Why? It's very strange. Oh, wow. Rebecca was here and I didn't notice. I don't see her in the chat if I'm seeing the current chat. So maybe Rebecca's not here anymore. Rebecca, I hope you're here. Hello. I'm sorry I didn't say hi earlier. You showed up late though. It's not my fault. Oh, cool. Rebecca's saying hi to everybody else. Okay. So, and I said I was going to get back to this and I do see that I was tagged here. Awesome. Okay. So I think you're really super duper against torturing babies for fun, even though you don't affirm it as objectively the case that baby torture is wrong as a stance-independent normative fact. Yeah, well, I am. I'm very much against baby torture. I see no value in baby torture. I'm very against it. And if you're wondering, why baby torture for fun? Because it's there's a few reasons. One, pretty much everybody agrees baby torture is bad. And why for fun and why babies? So part of the reason you will tend, it's useful to use this example is because if you talk about adults, people will start assuming possible variations. Well, what if it's a person that knows the cure for cancer? Or what if it's an enemy that's going to kill 1 million people if you don't torture them? People will start to extrapolate and build possible contingencies or sort of project possible variations onto the scenarios. If you say it's a baby, people will be less inclined to start trying to say, well, what about under this context? What about in that context? Now, there's nothing wrong with people doing that. When people start building and adding those contexts in, they're doing what useful human brains do, which is recognize that context matters. So there's nothing wrong with people doing that. But the problem is that the whole point of a hypothetical, there's a reason they're called thought experiments. Recall that what an experiment is when you conduct an experiment, you're trying to isolate all the extraneous variables that you don't want to potentially influence your outcome. And that's the whole point of a thought experiment. You're trying to isolate all this. You're saying, set aside all the variation. Don't think about that. Just imagine the case straightforwardly as it is. And often people struggle to do that. And it can take quite a bit of philosophical training to get good at doing that. Okay. So, and this relates to an earlier remark. It's almost sounding like you think they ought not do this thing. And that's exactly it. Of course, I think that they ought not do this thing. Nothing about, and I think this is in reference to me thinking that moral realists shouldn't employ normative entanglement. And the answer is yes. I don't think that they should employ normative entanglement. Or flip inverted, I think that they shouldn't employ normative entanglement. Nothing about me being a moral anti-realist entails that you can't have normative positions. Of course, you could think things are morally good or bad, right or wrong. For the same reason, again, just bring it over to food or music or whatever, your music preferences. Do you think your music preferences, let's say you like for instance, I like metal, I like a lot of metal stuff. I'm not particularly thrilled with classical music. That upsets a lot of people, but I don't care. That's what I like. Now, if I say I like metal music more than classical music, I don't imagine I'm correct about this. Like if someone has different music preferences than me, I don't go, oh, well, why are you listening to that music? That's like false. What you're doing is false. You're incorrect to listen to that music. You shouldn't listen to that. You're incorrect. You're mistaken. That's bizarre. Why are they mistaken for listening to music I don't like as much as they do? Or I'm just not currently in the mood for it. This is silly. I don't think you have to be correct or incorrect in an objective sense to like some music more than others. And it's the same thing for morality. You can have standards and values that, you really care about. You have to think that they're correct. Now, the problem is this other problem. I think I spoke about this last week. I'm sure I've spoken about it before on the live streams, which is that people make this other mistake. It's like the analogy or the comparison fallacy or whatever. This is the mistake. You can compare things along one dimension, and people will mistakenly infer that you're comparing them along other dimensions, even if you're not saying that. For instance, suppose I compare, gold paint and a bar of gold. And I say they are both gold, or they both look gold. Am I saying that the gold paint is worth the same, worth as much money as the bar of gold? Of course not. The bar of gold is worth a lot more money. Just because I'm comparing the appearance of the two objects doesn't mean I'm comparing their monetary value. Just the same, if I say moral values and food preferences can only be at best true only relative to the standards of individuals or groups or whatever. I'm not actually endorsing relativism about this. This is just an example. If you say that, all you're saying is that we should understand the truth status of metanormative claims in the moral domain and the gastronomic or the taste domain to both only be true in a relative sense, not in an objective sense. What this does not entail, just like the gold example, is that you're comparing them in any other respect. And yet, for whatever reason, not just non-philosophers, but professional philosophers, they can have a PhD in ethics and they'll still do this. They'll think, so you're saying that if you're a relativist, that, murder is trivial. It's only as important as liking mushrooms on pizza. No, that is not what's being said. If the person meant to say that, they probably would. So if you see me getting a little frustrated about this, it's because this comes up so frequently and it's just so obviously wrong that it's annoying for people to continue doing this. And they need to stop. It's so stupid. If you think, if you're like, look, I'm only a relativist about, you shouldn't say only. See, even I fall into saying these sorts of things. If you say, look, I'm a relativist about morality, someone could say, oh, so, you're saying, and let's say you give a food analogy. You're saying that the wrongness of baby torture is as trivial and unimportant as mushrooms on, your preference for mushrooms on pizza. Nope. It's not what's being said. And that's not what's being said. They're being compared with respect to their metanormative characteristics, not with respect to how important you think they are. It's completely consistent with being a moral anti-realist or a relativist to say, no, I care a hell of a lot more for the wrongness of baby torture. I think it's awful and disgusting and repugnant, and we need to throw everyone that does it in prison. And I will personally invest tons of resources into tracking down baby torturers and throwing them in prison because it's a freaking nightmare. And I'm just that much against it. You could say, how important is this to you on a scale of 1 to 100? 100, maximum importance. I'll break the scale, how much I oppose baby torture. And then you ask them, how much does it matter to you? Hey, we're going to order pizza. They don't have mushrooms. Can you get peppers or onions instead? Yeah, sure, whatever. It's a 4. Mushrooms could just not be very important to you at all. Completely consistent with relativism, completely consistent with anti-realism. Thinking that morality is relative or being an anti-realist about morality, a non-cognitivist, an error theorist, whatever it is you are, has nothing to do with how important you think these things are or how much it matters to you. It just doesn't have anything to do with it. And it's just constantly being insinuated that if you're an anti-realist, you can't have normative positions. You don't care about things. You're a bad person. It's not an implication or an entailment of the position. It's just not. And yet people are constantly doing it. And it's so absurd because there is no intellectual merit in this at all. It's just not true. If this were true, why would do you expect me to be out stabbing babies or whatever right now? I mean, it's absurd. Of course I wouldn't do that. So it's it's nonsense. But I do appreciate the remark. So thanks for bringing that up. And, if I don't persuade you that moral anti-realists like me can be against baby torture, or can think people shouldn't employ sneaky rhetorical strategies or whatever, I hope I can. But if I can't, that's fine. I do my best. Okay, let's see what else we got. And just popping into voice of delight and approval of Sophistic, yeah. Yeah, and you could say sophistical. Yeah, it's a sophistry and mischief mixed together. Let's see what else you got. Okay, I see people talking to each other. See this. Some people infer metaethical conclusions from ethical premises. Isn't that fine? Why object to that? What's the problem? It would depend on exactly what the context is, whether it would be okay with me or not. And a person can always just disagree with me about whether there's any implications in either direction. So someone could say, look, on my philosophical view, this metaethical position has these normative implications, or they could say this normative view has these metaethical implications. And they could say you're wrong, but they could say, well, no, you're wrong. So we could just disagree about that. Yeah, so if the anti-realist says yes to, it depends on what question is being asked. If the question is, do you think it's wrong to torture babies for fun? The problem is that if you say yes, they could say, oh, so you're conceding to the realist. They could say, they could sort of do this kind of historical revisionism where they treat their original question as though they were asking a question about metaethics. That's if they say, do you think it's wrong to X? And so you have to be wary of that if you're an anti-realist, because it wouldn't be appropriate for them to imply that you're saying yes to a question you're not saying yes to, like that you're conceding to a realist conception of wrongness. If they make it objective, if they say, do you think it's, explicit, if they say, do you think it's objectively wrong to torture babies for fun? If you're an anti-realist, it's not consistent with anti-realism to say yes to that. Yeah, I mean, you could call it infantile if you want. It's a matter of creating the term to illustrate a point. As far as objective having an established role in our language, I don't think that's going to help you very much in these sorts of contexts. Part of the reason is that objective has various colloquial usages, but the use of objective in philosophical contexts, it becomes a philosophical term of art. It's a piece of technical jargon that's typically used to express something. It actually is used in multiple ways, but one of the ways, and it's fairly common now, although some people would dispute this usage, is to refer specifically to stance independent. And so it's sort of philosophical term of art. There's nothing wrong, especially in a philosophical context, with drawing attention to the implications of various philosophical moves or strategies by creating terminology. And for what it's worth, the word magic already has established roles in our language as well. So if anything, I would bet people use the word magic more than they use the word objective. Yeah. Let's see. I see Rock on Lance. Thank you very much. Still trying to get caught up. There's so much here. Thanks everybody for being so engaged with the discussion. Still going through. And if you got more questions, let me know. Also, I'm almost to the end. So if you asked a question and I skimmed by it too quickly, then I apologize for that. Also, I want to make a point not just of responding to questions, but it's hard to read the entire chat when there's that much of it and draw attention to helpful and interesting comments. But if you say hi, I'll definitely try to make a point. For instance, Danny said hello. I'm not even sure when. Oh, that was over 15 minutes ago. Look how far behind I am. Hi, Danny. I hope you're still around. People should stick around. All right. What else do we have? There's just so many comments. This is awesome. Okay, let me just get caught up. Oh, I see. Yeah, conceptual sludge. Thanks. Yeah, sometimes I come out with some good terminology. Sometimes it's a bit clunky and awkward. Let's see. I am almost caught up. Okay, here's one. Your gastronomic comparisons make sense to me, but I wonder if they would be very convincing to most people. I don't think that they are. I think that there's a few reasons why. I think that for some people, the obviousness of the conceptual distinction between morality and other sorts of normative domains is just so overwhelming. It's like a bright light in your face and you can't see the comparison, the purpose of the comparison. That's not a very flattering way to describe the view. Other times I think people, this is also not flattering, are doing what I said earlier, which is if you compare food and morality along metanormative dimensions, they assume or they infer, or in some cases, I don't know how conscious or not it is to make this error. It could even be deliberate in some cases, but I don't typically think it is. They'll think that you're comparing them along other dimensions. You're not comparing them along. In other words, this is an important one. Typically with food or music or other personal preferences, it's not a feature of our preference that they are imposed on other people. So if I like wearing the color purple, it's not typically part of my view that other people should wear the color purple. Or if I like, listening to certain kinds of music, that I think other people should also listen to that music. It's just not a feature of that preference. And so people will draw attention to this and think that there's something deeper at play here. Well, moral attitudes aren't like this. They extend to other people. You don't just have the view that you shouldn't steal. You have the view that nobody should steal. But there's nothing incompatible with a view being anti-realist or merely, you could call it merely. I put that in air, merely. It's not really merely. Something being an expression of your preferences, that you have preferences about how others conduct themselves. In principle, you could prefer that everyone listen to the same music, or you could prefer that everyone eat certain foods. That'd be a bit silly and pointless. But there's nothing conceptually flawed about being an anti-realist and having a preference that other people not steal or murder. There's not an error in that. So this idea that if it applies to other people, it can't be a mere preference, that's just a mistake. That's not true. You could certainly have preferences about how other people act, and there's no incompatibility or inconsistency there. Other people could just say, and this is often what you'll get, is people go, well, why should anyone give a shit about your preferences? I didn't say they should. I think they should, but all that means is I prefer that they do, or I want them to, but they could just not want to. Yeah, so I know you're not trivializing murder, but if that needs extra clarification, maybe other analogies could work better. Yeah, if you have suggestions, let me know. I'm not sure that there's a lot of analogies that are quite as clear. Part of the reason is that you might in practice tend to get things that if people care a lot about it, it will tend to have this feel of realism for at least some people. And there's a sort of trade-off there. So the reason you choose something like food or music is because most people wouldn't treat it in a realist way. At least I suspect that they wouldn't. And the problem is that tends to coincide with it seeming trivial or less important. Still going through. All right. Do you know moral non-realists that are realists about value and meaning? No, I don't know any offhand, but yeah. So you could be a moral anti-realist, but you could be a realist about other normative domains. So you could be a realist about, value and meaning in some general sense. You could say, well, I think that there are objective facts about like what meaning there is, like things being meaningful or things being valuable. I just don't think that there are moral facts. And there's a variety of reasons why someone might hold a position like that. At least one possibility, although it's not very common, is you might think that there's no such thing as the normative domain. You could think that the normative domain is like this conceptually muddled pseudo domain, and there's not really anything that's distinctively moral. That's not a common position, but I just happen to be familiar with it because that's an interest of mine due to my studies in moral psychology. Okay, I think that has me mostly caught up. So if there's anything I missed, let me know. I'm sure there's comments and questions that I didn't see. So if you have those, ask those now, because now I'm finally caught up. And thanks everyone so much for all the engagement and discussion. It looked to me like a lot of what people were saying there were discussions with one another, and I'm not going to address all of that. Obviously, I'd be here all night. Cool. Okay. So we've got a lot of people around. I didn't see anyone tag me and say, "Hey, I'd like to join the discussion." If someone has, someone actually wants to come up on stage and talk. Is there anyone around that would want to do that? And if so, I'm going to have a few questions for you because I want to make sure that we have a productive discussion. I don't want someone to come up and start talking about, I don't know, some topic I have no interest in or don't know anything about. Oh, cool. What did you want to talk about? So there's a link, and I will replace the pinned message. Oh, great. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick break. Hopefully, a bunch of you don't jump out here. We'll be quick, and I'll be right back. And then hopefully we can have my first live stream chat with somebody else. I will be right back in 1 second. All right, I am back. So I'm going to implement a policy that I have seen on Bread of Life, which is if you want to come in the live stream, I'm going to ask you, especially if I don't know who you are, if I've seen you enough times and I know who you are, I'm going to have to see like a live image of your face, like to see that you're an actual person, and so that I know that I'm dealing with like real people, and they're not going to jump in the stream and try to do something to undermine it. Like, I don't know, all the ways that people could undermine it. So give me 1 second. All right, give me 1 moment. I see a few more comments in the meantime. Okay, just people talking to one another. All right, so Jamie is going to be joining us. Jamie, I sent you, yeah, just have a look. All right, welcome.
That's
welcome.
me.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So I think I have a grasp of what you're saying, like regarding the metaphysical claim or the metaethical claim is not, I can't articulate it very well, but so you would let's see, how can I frame this? How can I say this? You don't think that there's any way feasibly or like even theoretically to ground moral objectivity. Is that right?
It depends. So I typically will argue for, I don't know, there's not a name for it, but it's kind of a trilemma that I use, which is that I say that every version of moral realism is trivial, false, or unintelligible. And so there are versions of moral naturalism that I think are not literally false. I just think that they're trivial. So those naturalist accounts, are you familiar with those? I'm going to mention them to the audience, regardless. But
no.
Okay, so there are some accounts of moral naturalism that are distinct from the non-naturalist accounts, in that what they try to maintain is that moral facts are a certain kind of natural fact, or they supervene on non-moral natural facts. That's all just a fancy way of saying that in a certain sense, you could identify moral facts like murder is wrong with they could even be reducible to certain kinds of facts that are amenable to empirical inquiry or understandable via like our best accounts in science. One very simple example would be someone could just say, look, I think that moral facts are facts about what increases well-being and decreases suffering. And so something like murder will tend to decrease well-being and increase suffering. And that's why it's wrong. What it means to say murder is wrong just is to say it decreases well-being and increases suffering. There are facts, you could study them scientifically about increasing well-being and decreasing suffering. So moral facts are understandable scientifically. My problem with those is that they're just, in a certain sense, converting the, I'm getting an echo from you, so you might want to mute yourself. They're just sort of converting moral facts into certain kinds of descriptive facts. And then those don't have any authoritative oomph. They don't have any ability to compel, because they're just telling us, here's a descriptive fact. What I think you need out of a substantive moral realist position is the kind of thing that a lot of non-naturalists favor, which is this view that you really ought to. There's something irreducibly normative about the moral facts that is compelling or has some kind of authority over you. And those are the ones that I think you can't really ground those. I don't think they're intelligible.
Yeah, it sounds like what Sam Harris was trying to do.
Yeah, so Sam Harris would probably be considered a moral naturalist, and to me, that position is just relabeling. I don't think Harris ever really does anything to actually show that we should think moral facts are facts about well-being and suffering. He just kind of what else would it be? And Harris has a lot of implausible things to say about this. So, for instance, Harris, in reference to deontology, would just say it doesn't make sense. I don't get it, or nobody really thinks that way. I don't know that he says nobody thinks that way, so maybe that's not accurate, but Harris seems to struggle to imagine how someone could think that an action is wrong in virtue of the nature of the action itself and not in virtue of the expected consequences of the action. But it's very clear there's at least some people that think some actions are just wrong because of the action, not because of its consequences. So I don't see any conceptual impossibility in thinking that. And yet Harris seems to think like deontology is somehow impossible or absurd on like as if it's self-evident. And I don't think that's self-evident. I'm saying this as an anti-realist and as someone that doesn't endorse deontology. It's strange. It's like, has he not talked to moral philosophers? So Harris, though, isn't really representative of the naturalists in the academic literature. So this would be Peter Railton, Kim Strelny and Fraser have a paper in naturalism. So there are philosophers that endorse these views that have more developed positions.
Okay, yeah, I'm not familiar with them. I'm just thinking, so it sounds like, I just remember seeing the Harris present his information or his argument or whatever from his book against William Lane Craig, and then it sounds like you kind of accept the criticism that Craig gave, kind of like the switcheroo or whatever. I don't know. Do you see any conceivable way from a theistic point of view to have objective morality in any sense?
I don't, but it's also not clear to me that theism so a couple things I should say, and I think this might surprise people. So I'm not a theist. I'm an atheist. I don't believe there are gods, but I don't think theism is less plausible than moral realism. And it would have to be if I thought that theism required realism, because then it would be, the conjunction of the statements God exists and realism is true would be equally or less probable than the judgment that just realism is true. But I actually think that theism doesn't require realism. And I think that's a good thing, because I think realism is a non-starter. So I think theism is more plausible than realism. How exactly to work that out theologically, I'm not sure. It would depend, if someone says, I believe in this particular scripture, and the scripture unambiguously says moral realism is true, they've got a problem. But I'm not a Bible scholar. I'm not a theologian. I'm not an apologist. And I don't practice any other religion. So I wouldn't be an authority on whether or not scripture or theology actually commits the theist, whatever the religion may be, to moral realism. But I haven't seen any clear indications that it does. And when I've asked, for instance, of course, a lot of my interactions are with Christians. There aren't as many other people from other religious traditions that I discuss these matters with, just because of where I am and who I talk to and what my own background is. I haven't seen clear, scriptural evidence that the Bible, for instance, unambiguously endorses moral realism. And my suspicion is that's because the contemporary dispute in philosophy just wasn't something that was salient or relevant when the Bible was written. And I don't know that the Bible really needs to address this particular issue.
Well, maybe you can help me figure out if I should hold the position I do, because I guess my theology would suggest, at least it seems that way to me. Anyways, my understanding of theology moral realism would be a very intrinsic part to making sense of it or something, as far as the whole Christian, doctrine of redemption, etc. Seems so. Do you think? Sounds to me like you don't even think, even if God designs the universe in such a way, or like, what do you think about the Euthyphro dilemma? Do you think that's a valid criticism of, where morals come from?
I don't have it's a good question. I don't have a definitive answer to whether or not I think the Euthyphro dilemma raises some sort of insurmountable problem for theistic conceptions of morality. My suspicion is that no, it doesn't. So I don't think it's necessarily, I think it's useful for prompting deeper questions on the nature of goodness, but I don't know that it by itself sort of decisively undermines any sort of case for any particular metaethical position. But unfortunately, theistic conceptions of metaethical realism are not particularly common within the academic world where I spend most of my time reading. And so it's only very recently that it's really dawned on me just how much there hasn't been sufficient crosstalk between philosophy of religion, theology, and apologetics, their approach to metaethics, and the approach to metaethics that tends to be taken in what you could say is contemporary analytic metaethics, because most contemporary analytic metaethics, the people that are arguing for moral realism, one, they're often naturalists who are almost all, I don't think it necessarily has to be the case, but most of them are going to be atheists or secular in some way, and we could set all them aside. But even the non-naturalists, a lot of them are either going to be atheists or agnostics or whatever, or even when they're theists, they are used to and are trained in articulating secular arguments for moral realism, like, for instance, the companions of guilt argument or appealing to ethical intuitionism. Those arguments don't rely on theism. And so the people employing them, even if they are, outside of that context of those arguments, Christians or theists or whatever, they're not drawing on that. So that's what I'm most used to. But it looks to me like there's these whole several streams of traditions in metaethics that are outside of that sort of contemporary dispute that come from a theistic perspective, and I'm not as familiar with those. And my guess is that if I dig into the conception of realism that's being put forward, it might not even be the kind of realism I'm objecting to. I'm objecting to specific terms and concepts and ideas that I think are, for the most part, distinctive to contemporary metaethics. And so it could be that these theistic conceptions, I wouldn't think that they're unintelligible. I might just think that they're false for other reasons. Maybe sure. I could even be true, but it would depend on the nature of them. And again, I'm just not familiar enough with them. So that would be something we'd have to work out in a discussion.
Yeah. And there's going to be problems probably with my lack of fully grasping everything. But for me, I guess one of my beefs I have with like apologetic, philosophical, apologists or whatever in the Christian sphere is, well, on one hand, what they're arguing in the metaphysical domain or whatever, the moral realism, it seems like the kind of arguments they want to make then doesn't actually fit with their theology or something like that. Like it seems apparent to me that if you're going to, the way they argue, let's say, or get, like the way Craig argued, let's put it this for an example, like it seems if Craig, his answer to the Euthyphro dilemma, that it stems from who God is, like it's not above God or below God or whatever, or just arbitrary, but it's like a reflection of God's person. That seems to only be valid if you have a particular theological view. And I guess that's where I'm trying to work out making sense of it. And by the way, I just wanted to say, I like heavy metal and classical, and I think they overlap. So I thought it was weird that you don't appreciate classical music, but you prefer heavy metal, or maybe just certain kinds of it. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't hate all classical music, and I don't like all metal. Those were kind of just very rough examples. It was just the first thing that came to mind. But yeah, there's certainly cases where they overlap. I've seen some performances, like live performances, where metal bands will have like a symphony with them, and I think that stuff is awesome. And then there's like what is that one, Apocalyptica, where it's kind of classical metal-ish type stuff.
Yeah, like their guitar solos are like pretty wicked, like as far as having kind of a technical, I don't know what you'd call it. Just, it reminds me of some classical, just in its, I don't even know the word to use, just the melody, I guess. It's kind of cool. So I like both, but yeah, don't you think, what do you think of Craig's answer? I can't think of another answer to the Euthyphro dilemma other than Craig's. Is there any others that you're aware of?
No, but I'm not too familiar with the ways that someone like I'm not very familiar. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what exactly Craig's response amounts to. I'll make a general comment, which is that often a lot of the responses I've seen to the Euthyphro dilemma seem to me to push the question back to just another location, or to in some other way kind of just be obscure or hard to interpret. So, someone might say, okay, well, it's not that something is good because God says it, nor does God say it because it's good, but the goodness is God's, like people will say stuff like God is goodness. And I don't know exactly what that means. So like, it certainly can't be something.
Yeah, I think you might, there is kind of an obscurity to that answer. I don't see any other way to answer it and falsify the dilemma, I guess. But then another part of me says, well, so, this is just like a work in progress in my mind, and I'm aware that I don't fully understand it, but it seems like I can't conceive of another even route to go. Like the question is this a dichotomy regarding, the dilemma? So, but if God can change it, then it's arbitrary. That's obviously problematic to me. But the side of it that's seems more relevant or problematic is, is something good? Would something be good outside of, or, is God choosing it or something from above himself? And then that gets into the whole thing about like the nature of contingency and what's contingent, what isn't. Like, could God, if it's not above God, then how could he have designed it otherwise or something and still be actually moral or whatever? But I tend to think, well, it seems like you can have objective moralities only if God, something like the conception of God is creating it from, his nature or whatever. And it's just like kind of like a fact or something. And so, but then that seems like he couldn't have created it in any other way. And so then that puts it above him or something. But it seems like you can have, would you say something's objective? Like if you designed a video game and all the parameters of that world, and would it be objective that the way you made it, with its rules, like the software and the writing of the program and how that manifests in, the characters of it? Like, is it proper to say that, within those constraints that's objectively the case? What would you say?
I would say probably yes, but I don't think that that's the key dispute between realists and anti-realists. So this is why that trilemma I provided earlier is important, because think about it. Let's take moral naturalism. The moral naturalist says, look, I'm just going to stipulate that moral facts are facts about what increases well-being and decreases suffering. There are such facts, therefore there are moral facts, and those facts are stance independent. I actually agree that there are, if that's what you mean by a moral fact, then there are stance independent moral facts. But so notice there, I'm totally willing to concede that there's stance independent moral facts. Does that make me a moral realist? No, because I don't actually think simply finding anything that you could stick a label on and say it's stance independent entails the relevant kind of realism. When I'm denying moral realism, what I'm denying are these very distinct concepts that moral realists appeal to. And they're not the ones that I see theistic conceptions of appealing to. In fact, I think there's an old Q&A response from William Lane Craig where he draws a distinction between the kinds of realism I'm objecting to. I was trying to dig it up. I'll have to go and look it up. I'm not even sure Craig is a realist in the sense that I'm objecting to. He might actually be an anti-realist given how I'm using the distinctions. And he has a response to the Q&A.
There's something to that,
yeah. So I have a few things to say about all of this. So one is that the kind of realism I'm objecting to involves an appeal to what you could call irreducible normativity. It's the notion that there are conceptions of ought not, should, shouldn't, good, bad, that cannot be reduced to descriptive claims. And I don't think that there's anything like that. And I don't think there's anything like that largely on conceptual grounds. I don't think that it makes sense to talk. I don't think it's meaningful to speak of irreducible normativity on what you could say are basically just an understanding of how concepts work and how language works. And so to me, that's a bit like someone saying something can be tasty independent of how it tastes, or a bit like someone saying that something can be non-directionally north-facing. So they insist something is facing north regardless of the direction it's facing. That just seems like an oxymoron.
That seems agreeable. That seems right to me too. At least at this point, because it's like, well, like if you would the idea of something be true independent of ideas. I mean, it just seems like a category error or something, or I don't know. I'll let you go ahead. Keep going.
Yeah. So in a certain sense, you can kind of say that so this is something I said many, many years ago, where I said that it looks to me like and again, I'm talking about moral realism only in the sense that it's employed in contemporary analytic philosophy, almost seems like bad grammar. I've compared it to someone saying something like put the shoes. It's just an incomplete sentence. Put the shoes where? And they're like, no, just put the shoes. It's like not a well-formed sentence. It's not really a sentence. And what I have to say about these non-naturalist conceptions of realism is that I don't even think that they're like propositions. And so when realists present arguments for realism, non-naturalist realism, I think technically speaking, they're not actually arguments. It'd be like if someone said, flibberty gibbet, therefore God exists. That's not an argument for God. That's not an argument at all, because it's just nonsense. And it would be the same thing with realists. Your premises have to be legitimate, intelligible propositions for you to actually have an argument. Now, to address this Euthyphro thing, the more that I think about this, the more I think that this might just be a false dichotomy. Here's a way of thinking about it, because I think the Euthyphro dilemma might be implying more. It might be implying more than it can actually show. Here's what I think might be going on here. The Euthyphro dilemma is trying to imply that when it comes to an action being morally right or wrong, you've got two choices. And let's say you are God. Your two choices are either there has to be something outside of you that you didn't decide on, and that's what determines what's good. There's not any real connection between you. God himself is just recognizing what rightness and wrongness is. That's one option. And the other option is that God's attitudes or desires or mere decrees serve as the truth makers. They make it the case that the action in question is good. Now, here's the problem. The first one, I think, might be a non-starter if you think like God created everything or everything is dependent on God. So that first one, that implies God is not the omnipotent creator of everything, including goodness. And that's not very appealing as a view. Maybe there's some way of squaring that on theological grounds that wouldn't be an issue. And you could always just, a theist could in principle bite the bullet and say, yeah, God is subordinate to the moral goodness. It's outside of God. You could do that if you want to drop some of God's omni properties, maybe. But I don't think people are going to want to do that. So you drop that one. So you go to the second one. Now there's the sense that, well, if God says it's good, then that makes it good. And there's, I think, an implication that makes it, in a certain sense, arbitrary or kind of like relativism. So if you're a relativist, you might think like moral facts are facts about what something is right or wrong if I think it's right or wrong. And so let's say, currently I think murder is wrong. But what if through some freak accident, I get hit in the head, it damages some emotional part of my brain, I lose compassion for other people, and now I think murder is okay. If I'm but my metaethics is in some other part of my brain and it's intact. Now I'm going to say, yeah, now it's okay. Now murder is okay. And people might be concerned with that because they could think, wait, so murder actually becomes okay just because you prefer to murder? That makes your moral attitudes, in a certain sense, completely arbitrary. They're whimsical. I don't want that. That's bad. And I think the implication with the Euthyphro dilemma is that if we abandon the first one, that it's good, because your options are it's good because God says, or God says because it's good. If you abandon that second one, you're stuck with the first one. It's good because God says. I think the implication is that it's arbitrary, but I don't think it has to be. So I think if that's the implication, it's a false implication. Because let's just say there's a person that we know that they have certain characteristics in virtue of who they are as a person. We know that this person is loving, kind, compassionate, honest, sincere, and they always make good decisions. Okay, so now if they say this is good, then we could know that that is an output of a system that always produces good decisions. Like whatever, here, there would actually already be a problem here. What do I mean by good? So we would have to drop the normative language. We could use, you could say sort of thick descriptive concepts like compassionate or kind or loving. and we could flesh those out. We could actually give a descriptive account of what it would mean to be compassionate or loving or kind, that itself avoids normative commitments that would involve like question begging or smuggling our ideas in through the back door. Okay, so you say this person is compassionate. So you could say that they're never commit violence against other people. They always are merciful towards other people. You could give this description, like all these descriptive facts about the person. And then you could say, well, whatever they would decide, it would exhibit all of those characteristics. And so it's not their mere arbitrary whim that is making it the case that their judgments about what we should do, their decrees, their commandments are good. It's that they stem from the characteristics of that person. And those characteristics are things like compassionate, merciful, kind, generous, loving, caring, altruistic, selfless, all that. Okay, so any decree they give will necessarily have those characteristics built into it. Seems to me like that. I don't see why that's a big problem.
Yeah, that's probably true. It seems right. And that's, yeah, I guess I'm just, there's not like without flaw or something or whatever that means, but is the idea of what's trying to be upheld by God and not make him dependent, I suppose, on something outside of himself. I guess that's the motivation there. And that seems, what you're describing makes sense to me. Like, it's not, well, how do you understand when somebody says like, uses the term nature? I tend to think, I don't like the idea of, I guess because I'm going to be an advocate for some sort of free will, which I don't think you are, but do you think there's any distinction between, or a potential distinction with speaking of like God's nature, like that seems like God loses free will if you say he does something according to his nature. That seems like that's outside of it, outside of himself or whatever. What do you make of that? If that makes sense.
That's a good question. Yeah. So the problem is that like I don't study theology or philosophy of religion, and I'm not a Christian or a theist, so it makes it a little bit hard. So I have to kind of like put on my possible theist hat. I think if this becomes a problem for libertarian conceptions of free will, then if something's got to go, I would drop the libertarian conception of free will. But I don't think that means you have to abandon free will. Now, I don't endorse free will, but I don't see a huge conceptual problem with compatibilist accounts. So what you could say, like, often what I'll do when I talk about this is I draw a distinction between what you could do if you had different goals and preferences versus what you would do given your goals and preferences. And so what we could say, and this is one reason I have a problem with libertarian conceptions of free will and how they're often deployed in theological arguments like the problem of evil and divine hiddenness and decisive voluntarism and stuff like that. I don't see any logical incompatibility, even with, I don't know if libertarian free will would be incompatible, but whatever. I'm getting too much in the weeds. Okay. Let's just suppose you can eat whatever you want, but also you have very clear preferences about what you like and what you don't like, and you don't make mistakes about like factual mistakes in the world that you're in. As you go about the world making decisions about what to eat. Well, like right now, for instance, I don't like rotting garbage. I could eat rotting garbage in the sense that if I wanted to, like I would in fact go eat it. But I don't want to, and so I don't. And so am I free to eat garbage because I could if I wanted to? Right. So you could say I'm free to do it, but it could still be the case that I never would. And so you could say, for instance, God could do evil, but never does. And I don't see any logical problem with that. And in saying that God has free will as well. So you could like as long as it's true, people only act in accordance with their values and motivations. Is that a threat to the free will? Because what if someone only values and is motivated to do what's good? Then they don't have to do evil. But the problem is that I think that this spills back over into humans. God could have made it so that humans have free will and had no desire or motivation to ever do evil. Like, I just think there's no logical inconsistency there.
Do you think God could have determined a world that free agents only choose the good?
Yeah, exactly. So I think God could have created people that are both free and never choose evil. I see no logical inconsistency. And that doesn't entail that I think that they couldn't, because you have to get clear on what you mean by could or couldn't. If what you mean is physically capable, sure, people are physically capable. Like just imagine a world where all of these things are true. One, people are only motivated to do good things. 2, they only do good things. And 3, they have the ability, like the physical capacity to do evil things. So it's not like a world where we all live in like weird little bubbles where we can't harm anybody. They totally could, but they
like T-Jump's idea.
Yeah, like T-Jump's world. So they're not stuck in a T-Jump world. In this kind of world, if someone like did want to lie or steal or murder, they could if they wanted to. It's just that nobody ever wants to. And I think sometimes people think, but if nobody wanted to, that would somehow be a threat to free will. Because I've seen in arguments about free will, Christians say stuff like, there has to be evil or we don't have free will. Or if there was no evil, that would be an indication that there's no free will. I don't think that follows. I don't see why that would be true.
Yeah, I think this might be a problem from my perspective then. Maybe you can help me flesh it out. I think, so I want to say that evil is not necessary. And yet I feel inclined to want to say that world that we were just talking about, that is, could God make a free, a world with free will where no one ever chose evil? I tend to want to say that's not possible, or is a contradiction on some level, or in how I intend to mean it, I suppose. So yes, you could have it where like you could do certain things, but it, you know, like you said, the distinction between could and would or whatever, it seems to me there's something wrong there. I'm not sure what it is. So you could be free because you could do things, but God set it up in such a way where free will is still intact, but none of the bad things happen. You know, I don't know necessarily what's motivating me per se, but something feels wrong about that. So while I don't think God would need evil, or did need evil in my perspective, so that was an option that didn't have to manifest. It seems to me like that's kind of to say that you could do that is to smuggle in maybe a determinism on some level. And I'm trying to find the words to articulate what I mean, but it seems like it's not a real option if it can't happen, whether it did or not. I don't know. Does that make any sense? I'm trying to.
It does, but but I'm not saying it can't happen. So like I could eat garbage. I've never voluntarily eaten garbage, even though I could. You would agree I could eat garbage, right? Like if I wanted to.
And I've heard Van Inge make a statement like to when he's talking this sort of incompatibilism, or, you know, does libertarian free will entail, the idea that it's either incompatible or compatibilism or whatever, or I'm thinking the wrong term, but he said something like, I actually can't punch you in the face. It's like physically maybe I could, but he is like wanting to assert that he can't for some reason. It kind of reminds me of something like that, like the could or would issue. There seems like there's an issue there. Sorry, go ahead.
You're welcome to keep talking. I talk a lot, so sometimes I'll give you 10-minute responses. So I apologize for that. You're welcome to cut in and say, "Hey, Lance, shut up. I have stuff to say." You're the guest, right?
It just kind of seems like I've heard Danny, and it makes sense what you guys are saying as far as like, well, I guess I just have a problem even with Craig's view on possible worlds and like choosing between them. It just seems like that seems like overly deterministic, even though like conceptually, like you could have. I guess I'm looking for a description of free will where maybe it's just too free, I guess. But it just seems like you can't determine a world like the outcomes, or it's not free, I guess, or something like that. I guess there's something real about reality as time passes, or something that's more, I don't know, the free choosing between different free worlds just seems like you're determining the outcome, which is like it's a contradiction or something. I don't know. I don't have much. But
if there is, so like what I would say is I think that the following things are logically compatible. People have free will. Everyone desires to do good. No one ever does evil. I don't think there's a logical contradiction there. And if there is one, I've never heard anyone spell out what it is. What I can, and to build on that, you can have, I've heard people say similar things to you. Like someone could say, look, I can't, punch you in the face, or I can't jump into a pit of sharks or whatever. It's not that I physically couldn't, I have the physical ability, but I just can't. The problem here is I think that people are, I'm going to get Wittgensteinian about this stuff and say that people need to be clear about what they mean by the terms that they're using. What do they mean by can't? Do they mean that the laws of they're unable to due to the laws of physics? No. Do they mean that they can't because they're not in the practical position to do so if they had the motivation and desire, like the desire to do so? No. They're saying something like, I lack the motivation to do so, and I can only do things that I'm motivated to do. They might mean something like that, and that would be true. So there's certain senses in which they can, and there's certain senses in which they can't. And so when we use certain words like can or can't, we need to understand that those words can be unpacked, and something can be true with respect to one interpretation and false with respect to another interpretation. And so to treat them as either categorically true or categorically false is to misunderstand language, and to make it leads us into philosophical confusions and philosophical mistakes as a product of not understanding that language is amorphous and context dependent, and that the words that we use have multiple meanings. And people are constantly, especially when they're trained in analytic philosophy, tend to occlude, like this becomes obscure, like they're not aware of this, or they lose sight of this fact, and they're seeking the essences of the words. So they want to know, as a matter of objective fact, once and for all, can you or can you not, if you have free will, do this particular thing? And I think that there's no answer to that question, because they have a mistaken set of presuppositions about meaning and language that's causing them to think that, like, the word can and can't, the words can and can't are capturing these sort of essences that are out there. There's a fundamental and correct and fixed meaning to can and can't. And if we just figure out what that meaning is, we'll know the answer to this question. And I just don't think language works that way. And so I think that a lot of the problems that we have, a lot of the confusions and contradictions and seeming paradoxes are downstream of what, Wittgenstein would say is a bewitchment of, our thinking by language.
Yeah, that seems, I think that helps boil it down some. Yeah, thanks, man. Appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on here to talk. And also, you're the first person to come and talk. So I don't know if I can get out awards. So thanks so much. Are you headed out now then?
Yeah, I don't have much more I can contribute to the
Awesome.
thought.
Okay, well, now that you've been here before, you won't need to go through a whole check screening process or anything. So you're welcome to come back.
All right.
Just a quick question before you go. If I get multiple people in here, would you want to talk to other people too?
Oh, absolutely. Exactly.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks so much for coming by.
Yeah, man, I appreciate what you're doing, and what your attitude, and the way your honesty. So peace out.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Yeah, you're welcome anytime. Take care. All right. I might wrap it up there unless there's any final questions, comments, remarks from anybody. Does anybody have anything from me? For me. Let's see here. I see one comment. I've heard Bernard Williams, the immoralist argument used often in grad philosophy circles. I could see on your view how it does not work, but I wanted your thoughts. I am not familiar with this. If you want to elaborate, I'd be happy to do my best to address that. Polysemy is a global phenomena. Linguistics literature is pretty clear on this. Absolutely. And this is a really unfortunate thing. And it's one of those cases where I want to get metaphilosophical and really criticize the nature of contemporary philosophy. So what's kind of paradoxical and strange about it is that Wittgenstein is often hailed as one of the most prominent, important, or number one for philosophers of the 20th century in terms of overall influence. And yet I think, I don't know if a lot of this is due to early Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein is often divided into having this sort of early period and this late period. Wittgenstein thought he finished philosophy and quit for 10 years. And he worked as a school teacher and a gardener in a monastery and did a few other things, and then got slowly pulled back into philosophy after I think about 10 years. And then ended up writing the work that would eventually become Philosophical Investigations. And there's a few other things that were compiled, I think, after his death. And so that there's these sort of two periods. And I think a lot of philosophers, I think, are not too fond of the second half of his work, largely because he ended up taking this very quietistic approach to philosophy that criticized much of analytic philosophy as being riddled with conceptual and linguistic confusions that contributed to a lot of pseudo problems. And so his overall thesis would be most of what's being disputed in philosophy is just a confused pile of pseudo problems that once we understand the underlying philosophical, I guess you could say linguistic confusions that led us to mistakenly think there was a substantive issue, the issue dissolves. It's not that realists or anti-realists are correct. It's that nobody's correct. This was a pointless, confused dispute in the first place. It's not that we have or we don't have free will. It was a pointless and confused dispute in the first place. And there's something kind of enervating and discouraging, I think, for a lot of philosophers if what they're doing ends up being meaningless. It would be a bit like if people were doing astrology or alchemy and a famous alchemist said, hey, maybe alchemy is bullshit. Or, hey, a famous astrologer says, hey, maybe what we're doing is a bunch of bullshit. People are not going to be too excited about that person if they're really committed to what they're doing being substantive and real. The thing is, you have to, it's a baby in bathwater. I don't know why all the baby analogies. It's baby in bathwater. I don't think that philosophy is without merit and doesn't allow us to do certain sorts of things way better than we might be able to in other disciplines. I certainly think that there is much of value to be extracted from philosophy in terms of drawing conceptual distinctions. Logic is clearly useful for what it can do. Philosophy can be extremely valuable, I think, when it's understood when it's employed towards serving certain sorts of roles. But I think philosophers end up spinning their wheels on a lot of pseudo problems, and it's just a matter of sorting the former from the latter so that we could focus on the former. I think the problem is that a lot of philosophers are very much bewitched and enchanted by those pseudo problems, and they don't want to give them up. And if someone comes along and says that I think that these problems might be pseudo problems, people aren't going to want to address that. But the thing is, I think if we clear away what I take to be pointless disputes that are resting on metaphilosophical presuppositions that are false, that doesn't mean that the work is over. And now, I don't know, go become a carpenter or, work in an office job or something. I don't think that's the solution. And, maybe Wittgenstein was like, don't do philosophy, quit. That's not my view. I think there's a big role for philosophy to play in contemporary academic and non-academic circles in terms of its ability to facilitate and serve an auxiliary role to the sciences. And to continue to address what I take to be substantive questions. I think consciousness is a serious one to grapple with, and I think philosophy has a lot to contribute to it. If you've seen the way people without much of a background in philosophy address traditionally philosophical issues, they often do so in a way that's clumsy and just ends up being bad philosophy. So it doesn't have to be an anti-philosophical view. To adopt a different metaphilosophical approach is not to say stop doing philosophy. It's to say stop doing philosophy in this way. We can do it in these other sorts of ways. And I wish there were greater appreciation for that, but I'm not sure that there is. Okay. I see a lot. I see a couple more questions. Okay, no, that's okay. I think I'm almost about to hit the 2-hour mark. So for those of you who ask questions, if I didn't get to those or have other comments, what I will ask again, please, if you like the content here, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. I'm going to be doing these live streams every week, unless, I take a week off or something like that. There'll be more content rolling out soon. So please subscribe, hit the notification bell. I've been trying to schedule things in advance so you can see the notifications and when I'm going to be going live and when I have other content that's going to be here. Also, I just want to thank everybody. I saw that there was a very lively chat. I didn't get involved. I was too occupied with the stream. So thanks so much for everybody that's in the stream. Thanks so much for the people that kept a lively discussion going. Thanks for everyone for their questions, for their comments. You're welcome to ask comments, to pose comments after the video is up and it's not streaming anymore. The comments will be up and you're welcome to ask questions there. Thanks so much everyone for being here, and I will see you all next week. Take care.